Thank you for joining us today for the NASP webinar on the myth of IQ, 100 years of misconception and impact on fair intellectual assessment, SLD determination, and instructional planning. My name is Eric Rossen. I'm the NASP Director of Professional Development and Standards, and I will be moderating today's webinar. So now I'm very excited to introduce our very esteemed presenter today. Dr. Jack Naglieri is Research Professor at the University of Virginia, a senior research scientist at the Devereaux Center for Resilient Children. His expertise includes theoretical and psychometric issues about intelligence, cognitive processes, interventions, resilience, and executive function, and his publications include more than 300 scholarly papers, books, and tests. So with that, I will turn it over to Jack.
Thank you, Eric. I want to extend my thanks to Eric and the other folks at NASP who made this possible today. It's a real pleasure to be here and share some ideas. Just as an interesting little footnote, I've been a member of NASP since 1975 and spoken at every one of the conferences since, except for one, since 1978. So it's always a pleasure to be able to share some ideas with my school psychology colleagues. You can get more information about the articles and such that I'll be referring to today from my website. There's a lot of information there, a lot of different types, but really everything I'm going to show you today, you can read the actual articles from my website. And of course, I'll be talking about some of these different instruments that I've or referenced some of these different publications of mine. I like to start with the big picture first to help you understand like where we're going. So I think that what we do as school psychologists is so critically important to so many children. And especially when we do a comprehensive assessment. I mean, think of all the children's lives you have changed as a result of the work that you do, trying to understand how they learn best, trying to understand what might be interfering with their ability to learn. So I take this really, really seriously because we do have tremendous impact on the people that we work with. And I would also suggest that what we're doing in terms of comprehensive assessment, especially cognitive assessment, in a lot of ways is outdated. And today I'm going to show you in a short amount of time some of the strengths and limitations of traditional IQ and the tools that we have to understand them and interpret them. But here's the really good news. The good news is that we do have research that clearly shows that measuring basic psychological processes instead of traditional IQ is more socially just. It's more effective for identification of children who have a specific learning disability. And it provides instructional guidance in really very important ways. It also is not encumbered by knowledge, which I'll talk some more about. So this is the big picture for today. This article that I have on the screen is one that just came out a few weeks ago. You can also get that on my website. Yeah, that's kind of the written version of what we're going to do today. So this is the basic outline. We're going to talk about traditional IQ tests, strengths and weaknesses. We're going to talk about measuring basic psychological processes and the advantages of measuring cognitive processes. And we'll do that in the 53 minutes that we have left. So let's think about why we have what we have. I mean, oftentimes when we say, oh, I'm using a new test, you know, the 5th edition of something, I chuckle because we know the history. The history is really very important. And I'm going to help you understand this through my own history. So my interest in intelligence and instruction really started out in my first profession as a professional musician. This is the first band I ever played in, And when I was only 17, I was teaching guitar. And I learned that some of my students really were able to learn well and do really well, and others didn't. And I really wanted to know why. When I went off to college, I really resonated towards psychology, because really that helped me understand how not only people, but through animal learning and other models, brain-based learning, helped me understand how people learn. That's what I'm all about. How do we understand how people learn, and how do we know how to measure that? When I started working as a school psychologist, I worked in this school that's shown here, Champaign Elementary School, in the mid-70s. And I noticed something really curious, but I never really grasped the importance of it until later. And that was when I gave my intelligence test, a whisk at that time, and even still today, I noticed that a lot of the questions on the whisk were just like the tests on the achievement test, the test items on the achievement test I was giving. And I thought it was weird. Like you'd have vocabulary on your IQ test and vocabulary on an achievement test. Or you'd have math, arithmetic, word problems on both, and so on. This doesn't really make sense. And I think that the similarity of intelligence and achievement tests today is really the biggest problem that we have in our field. We should not give intelligence tests that demand knowledge, especially to students who aren't doing well in school because they've had some kind of learning disability, because then their IQ scores look lower than they really are. So any kind of an achievement-based measure of intelligence is going to be inappropriate for someone who hasn't had the opportunity to learn. This is really the fundamental social justice issue that my colleague and friend Tullio Otero and I have been writing about and speaking at NASP, that this is really a social justice problem. And as I mentioned, it's especially problematic for students who have a learning disability. Think about it. You don't read much, you don't get a good vocabulary. And when you sit down and you get tested by the school psychologist, we give a vocabulary test and we say it's one of the best measures of G on this instrument. Well, it may be, but it's confounded by knowledge. Because an ability test should measure thinking, not knowing. An ability test should help you understand how a person thinks, how well they can think, not be confounded by how much they know. So why do we have this problem? Just a little bit of history about this. The traditional IQ test that we use today, Wechsler, the Binet, even the Woodcock cognitive, differential ability scales, they all really are closely related to the work of the US military in the early 1900s. People like Thorndike and Otis of Otis Lennon and others, when they developed the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. In 1917, after developing and then testing these instruments, they determined that the tests were effective for aiding and segregating, eliminating mentally incompetent and classifying men according to their mental ability. And so I really think of this 1917 as the birth date of the traditional IQ with verbal and quantitative and nonverbal subtests. And now, of course, they're morphing into different kinds of scales, but basically it's the same thing. So, what we had was an Army Alpha. So this was all the vocabulary kind of stuff. And sorry, I'm just want to try to move this out of the way. And what we had was the Army Beta, which is, you could call it nonverbal, like a mazes or coding or object assembly. Now, take a look at whose book I made a copy of. Wechsler was a military examiner. He gave the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. And really, Wechsler had verbal and nonverbal portions of his test, right? But why did he have nonverbal tests, just like the military. Why do they have that? Because when people like this, Antonino Merenda, left southern Italy on this boat of the Cunard Line, he would have landed at Ellis Island, which in fact he did. And when he was there, they would have asked him questions. And I'm sure he would have said, no capito, he didn't understand. They would have put a little chalk mark X on his lapel because of screening out for very low functioning individuals at that time. And I know they would have given him a test like this, which is object assembly, and how he would have solved it very readily. And they would have said to him, go to Little Italy where you belong, which is what he did. He lived in this building on 111 Mulberry Street. He was my grandfather. And my grandfather never went beyond 8th grade in Italy. And he didn't know a lot, but he was smart enough to have his own grocery store, to be a successful businessman. That's why we had this alpha and beta, because as Yoakum and Yerkes said in their book, men who fail in alpha, the verbal, are sent to beta in order that injustice by reason of unfamiliarity with English may be avoided. They saw this social justice issue 100 years ago. I was never taught this in the many years that I was taught cognitive assessment. We should have been. Now I'm going to give you, I mean, it's not a Saturday Night Live weekend update, but I'm going to give you a little research update here to just give us a bit of perspective on things. Now, research on G. Of course, G is an important concept in our field. It's talked about quite a lot, G or general ability. If you go back and you look at Wechsler's definition, the aggregate or global capacity of the individual to act purposefully, to think rationally and deal effectively with his environment, aside from being, you know, not very politically correct, his, her would have been better. You know, it's really getting at overall ability, not verbal and nonverbal abilities, plural, which we so often talk about. And interestingly, in the forward of the Wechsler Nonverbal, of which I'm the author with David Wechsler, who was actually the best co-author I ever had, because he never objected to anything I said, because he was dead since the 80s, and we published a lot of that long after that. But anyway, look at what Alec Alpin wrote about Wechsler's view. The emphasis in the Wechsler Nonverbal Manual on the full scale that measures general ability non-verbally and not nonverbal ability is a way in which what I proposed and what I did with the Wechsler Nonverbal was so consistent with Wechsler. Because Wechsler remained a firm believer in Spearman's G theory. He believed that verbal and performance, or nonverbal, scales represented different ways to access G, but he never believed in nonverbal or verbal intelligence as being separate from G. This is really very important because, of course, we are encouraged to go well beyond G. Now, there's been a series of research articles that if you don't know about, you should learn about. And they've been done by a number of people, some of which I've known, like Marley Watkins, who's one of the authors on this this article. I've known Marley since early 1980s, and Gary Canavay, who I've known for a very long time. These are people that I know and I value their opinion. They have done a line of research on all the traditional tests using a variety of different psychoanalytic methods. And what they've found consistently is this small proportions of variance uniquely captured by the part scores, but support for the use of the scale, the total score. In other words, they're saying the total score has value, but we can't find enough variance accounted for by the parts to say that they should be interpreted. This recent paper also looked at this issue, especially as it relates to CHC, and they went back and reanalyzed John Carroll's work, and their results were the same. The results of the study indicate that most of the cognitive abilities specified in the three-stratum theory have little to no interpretive relevance beyond that of G, or general intelligence. That's a really strong statement. So it's what they're suggesting is focus the score interpretations on measures of general intelligence. And it's not just these two articles, it's a whole bunch of articles. So the implications are that the scales on traditional IQ tests are irrelevant. That puts us in a really tough spot because we really want to be able to measure more than just G, because we really want to understand why a student is failing. We need to know more than G. I mean, G, if you think about it, the whole ability achievement discrepancy thing for SLD, I mean, that failed because you're just comparing one big total score to academics. You never really found out what's wrong, but you can't get anything wrong because you require the overall score to be in the average range. So we've been hurting ourselves and hurting the kids. So we have to keep in mind that why we have this problem with traditional IQ tests is because they're based on 100-year-old concepts of what the content of tests should be. There is no theoretical conceptualization behind those tests. They weren't built on brain function. And most importantly, they require too much knowledge. The knowledge piece is really very problematic. Now, the only exception to this line of research, the only exception that has been reported in terms of all the different tests. So if, for example, these authors have looked at the WISC-4, the WISC-5, the WAIS-4, the Stanford-Binet, the RIAS, the WASI, and on and on and on and on. But the only test that they found that had enough variance accounted for after G was cognitive assessment system, the test that I published. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. So this is the literature. You can go read all these articles and get all this literature that's out there. I'm just presenting it to you so you know what's what. Now, let's think about this. Let's just let's just take one more little step here. Some people have said to me that yes, tests like the Stanford-Binet, WISC-5, the WJ, even the parts of the KBC, they have tests that require knowledge, especially verbal tests. And they say that these tests have validity as measures of intelligence because they're so highly correlated with G. I don't accept that logic. And I especially don't accept the logic that we should have tests of intelligence that have knowledge in them. I think about the tests that we have on a continuum, like the Stanford Achievement Test, the KT, the Woodcock Achievement Test. These are tests that are designed to measure knowledge. Tests like Steve Pfeiffer's measures, good measures of knowledge. Steve goes a little further than that, though. If you read my work with Steve, you'll see how. When you get to the Woodcock Cognitive and the WISC and the KBC, if you're not using the Luria model, then these are confounded by knowledge. It's not until you get to the nonverbal tests, or like the CAS, or like the UNIT, for example, Bruce Brackens and Steve McCallum's, that you get tests that are going to measure thinking more than knowing. And just as a point of reference here, if you read Joe Matarazzo, I don't know, I don't think Joe Matarazzo is as widely known as he was when I was first learning cognitive assessment, but he and Wexler wrote a lot together, and he has a very famous book, Wexler's Adult Appraisal. And I know Joe, I've known him for a long time. I have tremendous respect for him, and I've spoken to him about this. But if you read their book, Joe clearly says that a man's vocabulary is necessarily influenced by his educational and cultural opportunities. And when referring to the arithmetic subtest, its merits are diminished by the fact that it's influenced by education. So the impact of education on intelligence tests has been clearly known for a long time, but we ignore it. We ignore it all the time. I saw it as a new school psychologist, but I just did what we all do. I talked about verbal intelligence and nonverbal intelligence because that's what I was taught back then, but I don't do that anymore. Now, as I was saying, some people say that the subtests with verbal content are needed also because they correlate so well with achievement. And of course, this is a circular argument. If you have achievement in your intelligence test, you shouldn't be surprised that it correlates with your achievement test. Now, in my book that I published with Tulio Otero, we present evidence that, in fact, if you compare the correlations between all the different traditional tests with achievement and the non-traditional test, the CAS, with achievement, that using basic psychological processes actually correlates higher with achievement than these other instruments do. But recently, an important paper was published, and that's this paper by George Georgiou. This is a meta-analysis. They looked at all the research on the relationship between task theory and academic achievement, and what they concluded was that past theory correlated with achievement higher than any of the other achievement tests that have been published. So again, that's a good study for to look at. So now we're right at the point where I wanted to pause to give you an opportunity to ask a question or jump in. We'll just take a few minutes and then we're going to move on.
Sure. So we have a couple questions. One was, and you were almost getting to it a little bit, that does measuring thinking instead of knowing significantly lower the ability to predict achievement? You were sort of getting to that a little bit when talking about the correlation. Can you address that?
Yeah, of course, that's exactly what this study showed. That measuring thinking, in other words, past theory measures thinking, not knowing, that this meta-analysis showed that by measuring thinking, you correlate with achievement higher than traditional IQ tests with their verbal measures and their other knowledge-based measures and so on. So yes, that's where we're going. That's exactly what this study showed. Great question.
Another question came in saying, so if I understand you correctly, knowledge has nothing to do with cognitive or neurocognitive function. Would you say that's true?
What I'm saying is if you want to measure neurocognitive functioning, you need to measure thinking, not encumbered by knowing. But obviously, there's a lot of cognitive processing going on with utilizing knowledge. And in fact, cognitive processing is really, we can call it like a perspective on intelligence, but it's really a theory of learning. That's what brain function is really all about too.
Right.
It's really a theory of learning. Past theory is really a theory of learning because it's foundational to everything without exception that we can do. It's a function of brain function. So.
And then there was a final question, and I think you've sort of gotten to it, but I'll ask it anyway. And I guess it's a comment related around the face validity and the idea that career and long-term educational outcomes are heavily based on verbal skills and even verbal knowledge. So I don't know if you can address that.
Certainly, success in life demands good communication. Demands a lot of other things besides that, obviously, but demands good communication. And still, your cognitive processing scores are going to be a better predictor than traditional because they're purer. They're not confounded by knowledge. Remember, you don't want to say someone's not smart simply because they haven't had the opportunity to learn. You want to know how well they can think. We're going to talk some more about this, but these are really great questions. So let's take a few more steps. The big picture is this: we can do better. And I'll show you how. So when I started working on this area that I've been working on here now for quite a long time ago, we looked at Luria, and Luria theorized that human cognitive functions can be described in terms of, he talked about 3 functional units, but basically 4 basic psychological processes. I encourage you to read this chapter that Tulio and I wrote for all the neurocognitive details. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, but we don't have the time to go in it in much depth. But here's the big picture. So I'm using a simultaneous processing way of teaching right now. Simultaneous processing is about getting the big picture. And that's what we're doing. Planning, P-A-S-S. First is planning. This is thinking about how you do what you decide to do. That's like executive function. Frontal lobe. Attention is being alert and resisting distractions. Simultaneous processing, I already said, big picture, and successive processing is going to be required whenever you have to follow a sequence to do anything. Now, I want to draw your attention to something here. There's no psychobabble here. This is pretty straightforward. You can explain this to anybody. I've explained this to 8-year-old kids really easily. When I help them understand their strength, they're good at figuring out how to do things. But you really have trouble when you have to do something in order. For example, a true dyslexic child, actually. So it's important to recognize that what we have here is a very sophisticated theory based upon brain function, but it's easy to explain to people, especially parents, teachers, and most importantly, the students themselves. Because think of it all the time when you have some kind of finding and you're trying to explain to a parent what it means. It's not always so easy. This is easy. And it's all about measuring what a person knows separately from what ways they think or may have trouble thinking. That's the distinction. So let's look at this just a little bit more closely, past theory. So I first started working on this in 1984. Here's a picture of my colleague and dear friend, J.P. Das. And we decided that we were going to reinvent concept of intelligence and its measurement. So in 1997, we published the first edition of the Cognitive Assessment System. And then more recently in 2017, we published the second edition. And as you can see, we did age through those years. We both lost a lot of hair. And it's not an easy thing to do something really different, right? I mean, this is really different. And that's why it works so well. So I'm not going to go in to tell you all about it, just a few things. Traditional measure, like a 12 subtest version, a really short 20-minute version, a rating scale, and a Spanish edition. But they all get at the same thing: planning and attention, simultaneous, successive processing. So when we talk about planning, we talk about a neurocognitive function related to the frontal lobes, how we do what we decide to do. And I show you this little diagram on the right-hand side here. How would we actually measure it? Well, if you give a student a silly task like this, put XO under A and OO under B, kind of like coding on the whisk, right? But you say to them, after they know that these little codes go with these letters, you say you can fill it out any way you want. The student here did the XOs first, then the OOs, so the child organized the task, did the A's first, and then the B's next. That's a plan. And planning is needed for setting goals, making decisions, predicting the outcome of one's own and others' actions. Very important. Prediction, what should I do? What might somebody else do? Impulse control, strategy generation, and retrieval of knowledge. Sometimes the best plan is to get more information. Anyway, next, attention is really very straightforward. It's all about selectively attending to some stimuli and ignoring others. So we say focused cognitive activity with resistance to distraction and selective attention. And the Stroop test is a good example of that. Because when you look at the word red here, you want to say red, but you got to say blue. And that's what makes it such a good measure of attention. And of course, successive processing. This is all about sequencing. So planning with the front part of the brain, attention for the base of the brain, and successive processing for temporal parts of the brain. This is where decoding words, letter sound correspondence, phonological tasks, understanding syntax. This is where all this happens. Now, this is what dyslexic children look like. They can't do this. They can't work with information. And we often think, oh, they're dyslexic because they can't do phonological tasks. No, that's not it. The phonological task is a symptom. Successive processing is the foundation of the phonological tasks. And you can find more about that on my website. Look at any of the papers I've done with Steve Pfeiffer. Also, simultaneous processing, I already mentioned, is about getting the big picture. Like a progressive matrix is a really good example, but so is reading comprehension or whole language. When you have to see how things go together, you could think of it as visual spatial, but it's not just visual, and it's not just visual either. It could also be verbal. We have a verbal spatial relation subtest on the CAT. One fine point here, one thing to consider. We often talk about tests on the basis of their modality, visual or auditory. I was taught this in the 70s. Unfortunately, the research on the effectiveness of teaching by modality is pretty bad. Why doesn't it work? Because it's not about modality. Because the way the brain works is they have these heteromodal association cortex. That means once the information gets in, it goes to these parts of the brain where whether or not it's visual or auditory or kinesthetic or whatever, that doesn't matter anymore. It's really not about the modality. It's not about the content either. So you can have a verbal simultaneous test and a nonverbal simultaneous test. You could have a visual successive test and an auditory successive test and so on, because it's the level of processing is deeper than the modality. All right, I have a few minutes for questions.
Sure. So one person asked kind of the impact when assessing students with severe ADHD or executive functioning issues. I might even expand that to a range of other disabilities. Some of the research around that application.
Yeah, I think I'm going to show you that. Yes, I'm pretty sure I will. If I don't, I'll come back and tell you. Other question?
None other at the time. So why don't we go through and then we'll tackle the rest at the end.
Yeah, I won't forget the ADHD question. All right, so what are the advantages? Yeah, I will show you that in this next segment. What are the advantages of using a cognitive processing perspective? Well, I've already talked to you about, social justice. Now, I don't want to get too into the weeds, so to speak, about test bias. Because if you study the research on test bias, many people, I think, will, I'm going to say correctly here, but it's going to be correctly with a footnote coming, correctly say their test doesn't have test bias. If you look at things like item difficulties, item gradients, reliabilities across race and ethnic, factor invariance, and all that kind of stuff. But here's the thing. If you read the standards for educational psychological testing, they make it very clear that if a person has had limited opportunity to learn the content of an intelligence test, that test may be considered unfair to penalize the students for not knowing the answers, even if the norming data do not demonstrate test bias. This is very important. I went to a National Association of Gifted Children's conference last year and listened to a learned school psychologist say that IQ tests have no bias, but he left out this part. And I don't think that's right, because this is the important part. In other words, the impact that it has. Now, neurocognitive processes, past theory, for example, that do not rely on knowledge are much preferred because they measure thinking rather than knowing, and that gets around this problem of not knowing the content of the intelligence test. So let's look and see what we have here. So here are just 3 studies to give you an idea. I'm not just making this stuff up. We've published on this for a long time. This study, the first one, Hispanic and non-Hispanic differences are very small on the CAS. When Dr. Otero and I studied the CAS when given in English or in Spanish, we found out that you get the same scores, whether you give it in English or Spanish, and most importantly, over 90% of the time, you get the same conclusion of whether or not the child has a weakness or a strength whether you give it in English or Spanish. So your interpretations are going to be the same regardless of what language you give it in. This is really important because that's the end result, right? That's the most important part of what we do is we say, here's what I found, here's what it means. So that's a big piece. But trying to get rid of this thing here. This summary of research here from our Essentials book also helps us get the big picture on what's going on now. Just so a little bit of explanation here. In parentheses is really the description of the methodology. So like if you look at the SB4 matched samples, that means someone went and got a black kid and a white kid, matched them on demographics, and then did the comparison and found a 13 points difference. The WISC-5, a 12-point difference. And then when you look at normative sample, that means the groups weren't matched, they were matched to the normative characteristics. And then you can have statistical controls, which try to do essentially matching, but mathematically. And you see you have everything from 8 to 13 points. Now, when you look at, for example, the KVC, actually this matched study, this is the KVC study that I did many years ago. I think it was the only person to actually do a black-white study on the KVC. And you see the differences there. And then you see the CAS and the CAS2, and you see what you get. When you take out the measurement of intelligence, knowledge, and when you measure processing, brain-based conceptualization, it makes a difference. It is more socially just. Let's go another step. This is a really important court case that occurred in Elgin, Illinois. And this study is about gifted, but I think it has tremendous implications for what we do. You don't need to read all this stuff. I'm just going to tell you what's going on. In this school district, 43% of the kids are Hispanic in the district. 3% of the kids in gifted are Hispanic. Obviously, something's wrong. The Judge Gettleman, actually explicitly stated that after looking at all the evidence, he concluded that the district intentionally discriminated against Hispanic students. That's really bad, obviously. So how did all this happen? Well, they used verbal and math tests to screen for gifted, and they also used, interestingly, my Naglieri nonverbal ability test. But here's what they did. They required everybody to have really high verbal and math test scores from tests like the COGAT and achievement tests. So they effectively screened out the Hispanic kids, and that's why the judge ruled that they discriminated against them. Had they used measures that did not require the knowledge of English and achievement, which of course a nonverbal test provides, the picture would have been very different. This has implications for us because we use verbal and math test items all the time to decide how smart kids are. That's a problem. So I think the lack of a clear distinction between ability and achievement tests corrupt the very concept of intelligence. And we're hurting kids, and I don't want to see us do that. We really need to stop, because a child who hasn't had the opportunity to learn will be at a disadvantage. And you will think they're less smart than they really are. That's just not right. I have a paper where I've actually shown this to be the case. Paper published in the American Journal of Mental Retardation in 2001 with a colleague of mine, Johannes Royan. In this particular study, we had white and black kids who were given the WISC and the cognitive assessment system. And what we found was that the full scale scores for the cognitive assessment system for the white kids were the same as the WISC scores. So white kids, the same WISC full scale as CAS, not for the black kids. The black kids had lower verbal scores and lower full scales on the WISC, and the CAS scores were higher. Clearly what was happening here was because the black kids didn't have the educational opportunity, they didn't have the high enough verbal scores, and they wound up being identified as for classes for children, which we called at that time mentally retarded. That's wrong. That's a social injustice. Now, let's talk about the advantages, and now this will bring me to the ADHD. Advantages as it relates to SLD eligibility determination. So I'm going to use this case. This is one of Tulio's cases. This is not really the boy Alejandro, just a nice picture of a boy. So this is a young man who wasn't doing well in school and was evaluated, and here are his WISC-4 scores. When you look at these data, the KT and the WISC-4, it's very reasonable to say he's doing the best he can. He's not really that smart. It's kind of on some borderline maybe, but his achievement scores are like his cognitive scores. He's a nice kid, blah, blah, blah. You know what? That's not true. He has a 67 standard score on the attention scale on the CAS, and an 84 on the successive processing, but he's got really average simultaneous and planning scores. So all of a sudden, the picture of the student changes. By the way, in this case, the full scale is completely worthless. I wouldn't even report it because it's just misleading. But look, this is a different picture of the same boy. And it takes us in a very different direction. The test you choose has a profound impact on what you learn about a student, and ultimately a profound impact on the student's life. We have so many examples like this in our book and in our presentations. It happens all the time. Now, he's not a slow learner, as I would have said many years ago. He actually has a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes, which is the basis of a learning disability. Remember, SLD is a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes, manifests itself as an imperfect ability, blah, 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 all the academic stuff, right? So here's how it looks. If you use the discrepancy consistency method that I've been advocating for, which you could use this on any ability test, but I mean, obviously I think it should be used with a cognitive processing measure. But basically what you get is, let's just go back and look at Alejandro. Here's what you get. You get significant discrepancy between his planning and simultaneous and his attention and successive scores. You get a traditional discrepancy, good ability, bad achievement. But here's the most important of all of these, consistency. This tells you why the student fails. This tells you why. And that's what we need to know if we want to build any kind of intervention. You can get these analyzers on my website that does all the math, fills the triangle and all that. They're all for free on my website if you're interested in that. But let's look at profiles now. This brings us to ADHD. So, you know, if I'm suggesting to you that you should use a profile approach for SLD determination, it's fair to say, well, do you get profiles on any of the tests that we have? And I've asked this question a couple of different times and done several different analyses of the data that we have, and I'm going to show them to you in one big spot. So if you look at WISC-5 and WISC-4 for children with ADHD, everything's above average. If you look at WJ, everything's above 90. Look at the KBC, everything's above 90. You look at the CAS, everything's above 90 except planning. Planning is executive function, frontal lobe. That fits perfectly with our conceptualization of ADHD as an executive function failure. But how does this differ from SLD? Well, this is the research on WISC-5 and WISC-4 for children with specific reading decoding failure. A little low on working memory, but not that much. WJ profile, not much happening there. KBC, nothing happening there. But look at the CAS. Specifically low on successive processing makes perfect sense. These children who can't do reading decoding, can't tie their shoes, can't remember the combination to their lockers, that oftentimes have speech articulation problems. It's all about sequencing. That's a true dyslexia. But what's really scary is when you look at these profiles over each one, well, the WJ, I mean, it doesn't differentiate between the two hardly at all. So that's your, you know, a good approximation of CHC, which is scary because we really need to have more evidence there. You get this weird stuff with the WISC. The only thing that's a little low is working memory, but that would make some sense because digits span forward. You could think of that as involving successive processing, but it's so confounded by other things. That's why it's not so low. And the KBC, I don't understand. So we do get predictable differences. And you can read my profile analysis study, and there's a bunch of other studies done in profile analysis by Achilles Bartos and his students. And then just a little bit on instructional guidance. Of all my colleagues, and I have tremendous respect for all of my colleagues in the assessment field. You know, I can disagree with people, but I have respect for all of them without exception. And honestly, I mean that. But just to put things in context, I'm the only one who's actually ever done intervention research. I'm the only one who's actually produced a book of interventions that's keyed to the past theory. Because we can do that. It's really easy. This book has intervention handouts that you can give, not a copyright problem. You give to parents, teachers, and students themselves so that they can better impact the students' learning. And I don't have time to really go into all of these, but I'm going to show you one study and then I'll be ready to stop. This is really the best of the studies in a lot of ways, which is a randomized control study, which is very important because we can say the methodology caused the outcome. And in this study, we looked at teaching students, or encouraging students to be more strategic about what they do. I call it planning facilitation in my Helping Children Learn book. That's the intervention. And we compared the cognitive instruction to additional math instruction. And when we looked at pre-post scores on math worksheets, which were based on the curriculum that the students had already been taught, we see the students who got planning facilitation improved dramatically. When we looked at light numerical operations, the students who were taught to think improved more than the children who got more instruction. Same thing for math fluency. And a year later, we went back and found that the experimental group was still better than the control group. A year later, we never even were in the school over that interval of time. So I encourage you can read this paper, it's on my website, read the planning facilitation method. Again, in my book and other places, we've been able to show that cognition predicts response to intervention. That's what this study and all the other studies I've done clearly shows. Cognition predicts response to intervention. Here are a bunch of other studies that you can look at. And so we're right on time for some more questions.
Yeah, so there were a few questions about kind of interpretation of index scores, whether you recommend doing that within the CAS theory. And one person asked, what does the full scale score represent on the CAS?
The full scale score in the CAS really just represents a global aggregate that many times is misleading. Because usually whenever there's significant variability in PASS, I've written this in Tulio and I have this in our book, the full scale doesn't mean anything. It's just misleading. So that's not going to be helpful. You could leave it out altogether. If you have to report it, you can report it, but here's the score, but it's misleading. Just like Alejandro, right? He has this score, this full scale, but he has this really low score and he's really high score, and that's what matters the most. So on the CAS and with past theory, we recommend interpretation at the 4 scale level, not subtests. You don't have to figure out what the CAS subtests measure. We already established that with 20, 30 years of research. And that shouldn't be your job anyway. That's my job as a test author. My job is to be able to clearly articulate to you why the subtests fit on the scales and then show it with the vector studies and as we've done. with the, the validity evidence that we've done. That's my job. It's not your job. So you have 4 scores on the CAS. Those 4 scores, very powerful.
So along those lines, someone asked, could you use the CAS for exploring an intellectual disability, or is there even a general suggestion of, taking some of these more traditionally kind of verbally knowledge-loaded cognitive ability tests and supplementing that with some of these other more process-oriented tests? So kind of 2 questions in one.
So if the question is, should you give a WISC and a CAS? I think what you'll do eventually, if you do that, is say the teachers really want the information from the CAS more than they want the information from the WISC. And eventually you'll decide what you want to do there. That's what people tell me. People tell me all the time. When I first started, I would use the CAS and the WISC, and the teachers liked the results of the CAS so much more. It made much more sense. It really helped them understand the student better, blah, 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 blah. So you got to decide that. Is there value in knowing a child's vocabulary level? Sure. Is that achievement or is that intelligence? I would argue it's achievement and shouldn't be used to measure intelligence. If you want to say it's, a measure of G that involves knowledge, that's fine. But again, I think it's misleading. It can be misleading, and it could be misleading the other way too, right? Because you can get a high verbal score because the kid has a lot of advantage. You think they're a lot smarter than they really are, and they get into gifted, and then by 3rd grade, they're really not doing so well. Come on, we know that happens all the time.
So we only have time for one more question, and this question is probably one that could reasonably take a good 15 to 20 minutes to answer. I'm going to ask you to do it in 15 to 20 seconds. If you can.
Okay.
Yeah, you might have to get the guitar out. It's along the lines of whether you're using or the applicability of this theory and whether it fits better within kind of an RTI approach or a PSW approach to SLD identification. Especially, we've had a few questions for people with states that have the mandate on the process used.
Okay, it's made for processing-based assessment of LD. It's made perfectly for that, right? It's all about the pattern of strengths and weakness. I mean, I was the first person to start to talk about this in 1997 and in 1999 because it's a perfect fit. If you're doing PSW, it's the perfect instrument. If you're doing RTI, it is as well, because we're actually working with special ed folks now in a lot of school districts who are using the CAS2 brief like a tier 2, take a quick look, and even tier 1, try to figure out what to do to help the kids from an instructional standpoint. But I know I have to stop, but I'm going to end you with a little song that I heard when I watched that movie, A Star Is Born, and this song resonated to me. So maybe it's time to let the old ways die. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die. It takes a lot to change a man. It takes a lot to try. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die. Okay, everybody, have a good one.
Well, thank you so much for everyone joining us today. Thanks to Dr. Naglieri for an outstanding presentation, and